at one point in your life. But anyway, so to get back to the topic at hand, when I was preparing my remarks for today, there were really two experiences that stand out to me as shaping how I communicate about weapons of mass destruction and nuclear weapons in particular. And one has to do with the experience of my grandfathers. Both of them served in the South Pacific during World War II. One of them died convinced that if we gave up nuclear weapons, that would lead to World War III. He largely credits the bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki with saving his life. My other grandfather was a medic. He treated some people who were exposed after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And he believed the opposite, that unless we eliminated these weapons, they would eventually lead to our destruction. Now, the other experience actually has to do with my sitting where you are at this forum when it was called Generation Prague in 2014, and writing about it for Operation Arms Control today. And I was very excited about this opportunity because I thought that we needed to highlight how younger people are becoming engaged in this issue, why they're interested, and how we can use that to engage more young people. So I wrote the piece. It was set to go out in our magazine. I was very excited. And then we got the stats back, and it was the piece that received the least amount of attention of everything we had written that month, and I was very upset. But then I got to thinking about how younger people receive information. I repackaged it, I put a version on BuzzFeed, and I have never felt so popular in my life. So what these two experiences really resonated for me when it comes to communicating these issues is that we need to think about who we're trying to reach. And we need to think about how they receive information. And the who, I think, needs to come first. Because when we work in this field, it can be easy to become divorced from the conception that nuclear weapons, for many people, are deeply psychological. That they're grounded in a narrative or a context that has a commemorative density and a historical narrative that can be difficult for those of us, in particular, who didn't grow up with the knowledge of the Cold War to understand. You know, whether that is the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and their conception of that in World War II, you know, whether that relates to their experience of the Cuban Missile Crisis, whether that relates to having done duck and cover drills. I mean, my mother, I think, you know, was terrified at one point because they didn't have a bomb shelter in their backyard. So when we communicate policy, when we advocate for certain things related to preventing Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons, to denuclearizing North Korea, to reducing our own arsenals, I think we have to be cognizant of that context that drives the perceptions and the narratives in which so many people digest this information and understand it. And then equally, I think we have to face the problem that is much more difficult. How do we communicate these issues to a generation that largely lacks context, or whose context is, you know, the Avengers movie when Iron Man, you know, delivers the nuke up through the wormhole? These conceptions that are largely not based in fact, and are largely devoid from context. As Emma said, you know, whether or not people think we have 7 nuclear weapons or 70, or actually can name them. You know, what is that context for understanding? And how do we communicate a relevancy and an urgency when there are so many threats that bombard us in a 24-hour news cycle? How do nuclear weapons compete with climate change or terrorism or race issues or gun control? How do we connect nuclear weapons to the lives of a generation that has grown up largely divorced for their understanding? That's one of the reasons why I'm very excited to hear what Dan and Dmitry have to say, because I think they're taking a different look at how to communicate those issues. And that, I think, really leads me to, you know, the second sort of story that I mentioned, you know, repackaging something for BuzzFeed. You know, we shouldn't only think about the context in which people understand nuclear weapons, but how they're more likely to get their information. You know, who are we talking to when we're trying to deliver these messages? You know, writing an op-ed that appears in the Washington Post or the New York Times can be very powerful for a particular audience. But for people who aren't following these issues, is it more important to try and reach John Oliver, to have him do a piece about nuclear weapons? You know, are we thinking about the wide array of communications and tools that are at our disposal? And I think that, you know, for me then, when we're talking about sort of reaching young people, then we have to think about that relevancy challenge. We have to think about the timeliness, and we have to think about context. You know, I have spent a lot of the past few years working on the nuclear deal with Iran, and in 2014 I ran across a very interesting statistic, some polling done by the University of Maryland. And it found that 62% of Iranians had a knowledge and understanding of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. You know, that's opposed to only 26%, you know, here in the United States. So when we're trying to communicate these ideas to people who don't have that same context and understanding, who aren't bombarded by these questions or these issues every day, you know, we have to, I think, rethink both the message that we're sending and the delivery. And that, I think, offers a lot of opportunities for creativity, because there aren't those preconceived notions about nuclear weapons amongst the younger generation, and there isn't that same sort of psychological context. And I think I'm going to stop there because I want to hear what my panelists have to say about their ideas about how we can actually communicate those ideas.
Thanks very much, Kelsey.